So hello everybody, my name is Christy Craig. I am the publisher here at Hidden Timber Books. We are a very tiny press in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I've been doing this small press author reading series since April this year. And this today is the last event of 2020. So it's nice to close out the year with another great book. And we have lots more coming down the line in 2021, so be sure and keep an eye out for that. I wanted to let everyone know again, this is recorded. And if you have any technical issues or when we get to the Q&A, if you'd like to just drop your name in the chat box or your question in the chat box, that's the best place to reach me. I'll be hanging out in the background as well as talking back and forth with Karin during the event. But feel free at any time to say, hey, I've got a question or a comment, and I'll let you know when you can unmute yourself and pop on in. So I want to welcome Karin Cecile Davidson. She is originally from the Gulf Coast. Her stories have appeared in Story Magazine, the Massachusetts Review, the Los Angeles Review, and more. She's received numerous awards for her work. SYBELIA Drive is her debut novel from Braddock Avenue Books, which is another small press in Braddock, Pennsylvania. So welcome, Karin. I'm so glad you're here. I'm excited to hear about your book. I'm excited to hear you read from it. And I wondered if we might just start off by you telling us a little bit about your work and the kinds of stories you like to write. I saw on your website you've got a ton of publications, which is really cool. That gives us an opportunity to read a whole lot more of your stories.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks for hosting. This is great. And thank you everybody for being here. It's so good to see so many faces, familiar faces and names, because some of you are blacked out, but I know who you are and I know what you look like. So a lot of you know already about my background, but if you go like way back, it was me being bored in church, probably very young. And on the back of the donation cards, I would scribble and write little stories and things like that. So going way back. And that was when I lived in Florida in a town a lot like the one in SYBELIA Drive. And I don't think it was until I was in high school that a teacher pointed out that I had some talent for the written word. And he read a piece that I wrote out loud, and I was so embarrassed, mortified that he was reading my work in front of other people. And now I'm reading it myself in front of other people. So it's come a long way. But I grew up in Central Florida in a small lake town like the one in the novel, and in New Orleans, where my mother and I moved when I was 8. So I had a lot of Southern voices and storytellers around me, and I was surrounded by books. My grandparents had a big house with built-in bookshelves that were just crammed full of leather-bound and beautiful books that, as a child, I didn't have anything to do with because I was just learning to read. The only storybooks they had in their house were not storybooks; they were Charles Addams cartoon collections from the New Yorker, and probably the other closest one was Eloise, the naughty child that lives in the plaza in New York City. So those were my picture books. So, but as far as the literary voices that I turned to, Eudora Welty was definitely at the top of the list. A lot of, going through the core curriculum in high school and college, you're led to a lot of male voices. And I wasn't really introduced to women writers except for Eudora Welty and Flannery O'Connor and a few other Southern women writers until the 80s, when I started to just go off on my own, and I discovered Louise Erdrich, and much later on Elizabeth Strout and Jennifer Egan, Ann Patchett. So these are just a few of the contemporary voices that have influenced my writing. And having grown up in the South, the sense of place was really important to me. And I always tend to, even though I live in Ohio now, I tend to return to the Gulf South in my writing. I've also written stories that are set in Berlin, Germany, and fictional town of Dynamo, Iowa. But for the most part, I'd say 90% of my writing is set in the Gulf South. And yeah, it's strange. I started this novel as a collection of stories, a collection of linked stories. And I had my mentor in grad school and a lot of my peers at that point said, this is reading more like a novel. You need to rethink it. And so that's how that came about. I had no intention of writing a novel. I always had the intention of writing an unpublishable collection of stories because stories don't sell. But luckily, it worked out. And it's, as far as the construction of the novel, it's a little different. A lot of people say it reads like stories, and that's understandable because there's so many viewpoints. But yeah, I don't. So anyway, that's sort of an idea about my background right there, leading up into the novel. So shall I give like a, so SYBELIA Drive, some of you have read it already, others are just being introduced to it, but it's basically a look at American life within the multifaceted mirror of wartime. And it's the 1960s crossing over into the 70s. And the two main characters, LuLu and Rainey, are coming of age. They're sort of rushing past childhood into these heady teenage years, and then into young adulthood. So it goes from 1967 through to 77. So 10 years in the life of a child, you go from young child all the way to young adult. And they're in Florida. So you've got heat, humidity, all this tropicalia around them. And in terms of the kind of book it is, it's more of a home front story, and which it's set during the Vietnam War. Mothers and grocery store owners, the elementary school principal, these are all characters that sort of come from the periphery into the story because they're all voices that are part of the home front, and that's heavy with women. And the men, the fathers, husbands, sons are going off to war, and sometimes they don't return, and sometimes they do, but they're very changed. So LuLu and Rainey are sort of leading the way through the storylines, but you get all of these voices. And the intention there was that in wartime, there are so many voices that are coming forward. And I really wanted to allow that to happen. But I knew that in order for things to link, that there would have to be main characters that were pulling the novel forward. So somebody asked me about the structure, and it's so hard to describe. So I started thinking of it as a wheel. So on the inside of the wheel is Vietnam, the hub, and the rim is Florida. And then the spokes are all of the different viewpoints, all of the different characters holding these things together. And the wheel, of course, turns and moves forward. And that's how the novel, the storyline moves forward. So, so anyway, that's sort of the intent of it. And for the most part, people who have read the book, I was afraid it would be confusing to have so many viewpoints. Everybody said it's a page turner, which completely surprised me, and that there's not a problem with having this many voices because things overlap and keep moving forward. There is momentum. So I was pleased to hear that, that it works. So do you have any questions for me about specifics?
Yeah, so I guess, you're talking about this different kind of structure, and I like that image, the wheel, and makes me think about, so much changed about the war from beginning to end, just in general. And I imagine that those character perspectives are changing as the wheel is turning, like you said, as the story is moving forward. But how did you decide to put it together in that particular story, in that particular structure? Did you um, have all these excerpts that you kind of put together in a puzzle and that was just the natural course of things? Or how does it enhance the story in that way?
So the way that I started, well, there were a couple of reasons that I started writing the first story, which became more of a middle chapter in the book. And the reason that I wrote it was I basically had a dare from a teacher and to write something new. And I said, oh, a dare. Well, I guess I better do that because I keep going back and revising, and it is time to write something new. And we, at that point, had been involved in Iraq and Afghanistan for 3 years, about 3 years. And these memories of my childhood and my generation's war kept coming back to me. And one of them was being a young child in Florida and having this experience that was pretty profound and shocking and not something that a 6-year-old would understand. And so reflecting back on why does this keep coming forward? And I wrote, the first story was actually Rainey's story, Forever and a Day, or one of Rainey's chapters. And I was really curious about LuLu, her friend, who kept beating up on her and was really feisty. And so I wrote a linked story in LuLu's point of view. And then I wrote another one about Saul, LuLu's brother, and then it just kept happening. And so the configuration came from that. And then it became something totally different because I got so excited about including everybody that I got a little out of control. And I had to keep track of things. And there are a lot of different ways for novelists or even story writers to keep track. And I had a wall, at that point I had a closet next to my desk, and I could open and close the door. The door opened so that I could see the side of it or the inside of it. And I put Post-it notes there, one for every chapter. And inside of the Post-it notes were smaller Post-it notes. So name of the chapter, when it's taking place, who the viewpoint is, and it went on. And then I would have quotes from all kinds of different people, from Yusuf Komunyakaa, who's an amazing poet, who he himself was in Vietnam. He served in the war and is an awarded poet these days. He wrote Dien Kai Dao and just a lot of other people who were writing about the Vietnam War, but then also, since part of the novel takes place in Vietnam, poets that were speaking about their experience in wartime, but through poetry. So I had little lines for other characters like Helene and the little girl Anne, who has a very brief chapter. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but it was just this like sort of wild confetti of movement and characters and the story happening. And in order to control it, I had to move things around a lot. And it does move back and forth in time. So I wanted to make sure that even though we go from chapter 1 in 1967, and then you have the brief chapter with the elementary school principal in the second chapter, and that's going back a few years, that it's still making sense, that it still has this forward movement. So I've always questioned my ability to, and my strength at plot. I'm better with character, but character can drive plot. So I just had to make sure that there was that momentum that was pulling the story forward. And then getting all the wartime voices in there, because there are so many different opinions, that whether it's peace protests or it's time to, for like a father talking to a 17, 18-year-old son, it's time to get down there to the board and enlist. Time to go. This is what we do. So all different kinds of opinions coming forward.
Yeah, I think that's why that image works really well, to think, you've got the war in the middle, and then everyone, rooted in this place in Florida, kind of coming from all different aspects of it. Would you be up for reading an excerpt for us?
Sure. Yeah. I was thinking about the question that you gave about the setting. I haven't quite figured out where to dive in for that. I mean, pretty much anywhere you could dive in for that, but I also don't want to read something that would give that section of the book away. So what I had chosen today was the two most difficult characters that I had writing, who are LuLu's father, Royal, he's older when he enlists. He's not an 18-year-old, 19-year-old who was drafted. He is someone who feels that he's dedicated to his family, but he's also, he has a devotion and a mindset that it's important to serve, even though his wife is furious about that, and his daughter is very confused, and his stepson is as well. And so he and there's a French woman who lives next door to Royal and his family. There's an orange grove that separates their houses. And she was also difficult to write because she is going through the early stages of dementia. So Marine Corps sergeant and French woman who grew up in outside of Paris, but also in a colonial section of Vietnam on a rubber plantation. So the first one had too many places that were going to be spoilers. So I couldn't give you anything from Royal's chapter. But there's so many sections where LuLu, his daughter, who's very attached to him, she gives a pretty good idea of what he's going through. So I have this section from one of her chapters. LuLu and Rainey, by the way, have 3 chapters each, and the rest of the characters just have 1. And some of them are as short as a page or as long as 5 pages. But they're brief. And then there are other more main characters like LuLu's father, Royal, her mother, Minnie, Rainey's mother, Ava, Saul, LuLu's half-brother. And anyway, so this is from The Late Afternoon Light Crashed All Around. And this is 3 years into the 10 years cycle of the story. It's May, June, 1970. And I do read voices for them, so bear with me. Days melted by, May into June, and Daddy moved around the house like he had to memorize it all over again. He had come back, and we were all getting used to the new way he walked and talked. He still laughed, but rarely and with restraint. And in response, we were cautious, too quiet, holding our breath, waiting to slip back into the way things had been before. By trade, my daddy had been a carpenter, and now he'd have to learn to live on GI benefits, to depend on others to offer their help, because he wouldn't want to ask for it. The moment he stepped in front of his own home, the one he'd built, everything changed. Or maybe everything had changed once he walked away 3 years ago and boarded the flight to Vietnam. Tired of being careful, I sidled up to the window seat in the living room where Daddy was sitting and having a smoke. A nearly full ashtray rested atop the seat cushion. I moved it to one side and then perched on my knees next to him. I played with the hem of his shirt and touched the edge of his sleeve, and he smiled. "Where'd you go?" I asked him. "I've just been sitting right here, Lou." His eyes crinkled, cheerful and sad all at once. "No, I mean, where'd you go over there?" "In Vietnam." "Oh, over there." He tucked me under the chin. He tucked me under his chin, my back against his chest, both of us now looking out the window. "I've been to the other side, to emerald mountains and faraway fields of tall waving elephant grass, places that should have been beautiful, places that should have held shrines, but I lost men there on days bright with sunshine, crossing rivers rough with rain in the blackest of nights, stepping on landmines, getting shot at the top of our eyes, just trying to have a smoke." He spoke to me as though I weren't even there, as though he were talking to himself. And then he put out his cigarette, stubbing it 3 times into the glass ashtray by his knee. I turned around to look at him, but he stared right past me. And from across the room, Mama held a finger to her mouth. She'd been standing there listening. And now she gave me a look, the one that meant hush your mouth or pay the price. And for weeks now, we'd all stayed quiet about the price Daddy had paid and would keep on paying the rest of his life. I held Daddy's hand and sat with him, not asking any more questions, just letting things be. I puzzled over his words, how they sounded like they were right out of storybooks, how there was another side to the stories. At night, Daddy woke up screaming sometimes, saying things that made no sense. He seemed not to be home yet, but somewhere else, a place that claimed him, a place he couldn't leave. It wasn't until later that I understand what war meant, why boys sometimes never came home, what had happened to my daddy in that faraway field of tall, waving elephant grass, where day became night and everything could change in an instant. So that's LuLu about her daddy Royal. And gives you a little bit of place from Vietnam because of the way he goes off into his dreamy way of describing things.
Yeah. So with Vietnam being the center of this, the thing that connects everyone together in this story, did you do a lot of research or what was the impetus that had you choose that particular time period or that experience?
Well, as I said, we were involved in, as a nation, we were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I was called to comment about the home front. I felt called to comment about the home front, and there were a lot of books coming out about some by veterans, some by wives, military wives. Siobhan Fallon comes to mind. She wrote When the Men Are Gone. So linked, some of the stories were linked, some of them were individual stories. She wrote a collection that came out about that, which is absolutely gorgeous. But it had to do with what was going on then. It wasn't heading back to the past. My own experiences, especially as a child growing up in a time when the all of the things that were going on in Vietnam were shown on television, on the nightly news. So we had a view straight there, rarely edited. There was, so there was some pretty amazing violence that was shown. And so this was from young child all the way through my teenage years. And as a teenager, I started hanging around with boys who were 19 coming home, and they had this intense kind of quiet about them. And I was always curious about that we didn't ask, what did you go through? It was just not something that we were kids. We wanted to hang out and have fun, and we weren't talking about that. And we were also caught up on our own whirlwind teenage kind of life. And so, it just wasn't a topic that came up. And even if it did, I imagine they would not have wanted to talk about it. They wouldn't have said anything. So I was very curious about this. And I think that helped me write a bunch of the characters who are men who have been to Vietnam in the novel. And I did feel completely stranded as far as military lingo. So I had, my best friend was it was a vocabulary book for the war terms specific to the Vietnam War. And I was online all the time. I mean, this is at the point where you could Google everything. And I didn't know I didn't know if my main character, Royal, one of the main characters would be in the Army or the Marines, or what he would be doing in the Navy, since he was in Florida. And I came across a lot of articles about the Combined Action Patrol Marines, who were more of a peacekeeping unit. And I read a ton of books, and then I found a group of Combined Action Patrol veterans who had been in Vietnam. And I wrote an email to the head of the group and asked if they could help me basically locate some things on military maps, because I wanted to give Royal a specific hamlet where some action takes place in backstory. And literally it's like 3 paragraphs that I wrote, and there's some other ones that come up, but few and far between. And I spent a year reading all these books and talking to the Combined Action Patrol Marines online. So what happened was I asked this question, and he said, I don't know that, but I bet somebody in the group will. And when he responded to me, he CC'd over 100 Marines or Marine veterans, and everybody responded. So, which was very overwhelming but it was great, because I was making a lot of mistakes and they corrected me. And some of them was in all caps. What the hell do you think you're doing? That man would not be a first lieutenant, he'd be a sergeant. And I'd say, okay, thanks. So there was that aspect of it, as far as what was going on in Vietnam during the war. There was also, I wanted to give voice to the children that were the Vietnamese children that were affected by the war, but I did not, this is not my place, this is not my story. So I knew that it would be brief, and mostly it would come from other characters' points of view. There's the little girl Anne that Royal meets in Vietnam, and she has a very short, like 1.5 page chapter later in the book. And so anyway, I'm getting kind of lost. I'm circling.
No, it's nice to hear about that research. And like you said before, in wartime so many voices come forward, and I think it's not surprising that you got so many responses from the past, from the Marine veterans, because I think at a point people want to talk about it, people want to share that. Like you think about World War II veterans that don't say anything for years and years and years, and then suddenly they have this great desire to tell what happened. So it's and a lot of times when we do research for stories, we don't use half of it, we don't use 3/4 of it, but it helps build the tone, it helps build just the atmosphere that we want to leave with that story for the reader. So it's
Exactly.
all it's all important.
Yeah,
Um,
there were a couple of other things that I never expected to research. One of them was West Palm Beach nightclubs. Another was the anatomy of a canoe. And I know a lot about canoes, but I didn't know all of the parts of the canoe, very specific. So I mean, just like funny little things like that would pop up and go. Rubber plantation in Vietnam. How do you describe that?
So let's talk a little bit about place, because you've got things happening in two different areas of the world, in Vietnam and in the Gulf Coast. Are there, you grew up in the Gulf Coast, around the Gulf Coast, a lot of times I know as a writer, we return to the place of our roots because it's just so embedded in who we are. And so it often just shows up in our stories. But if you think about place as character, what is it about the Gulf Coast that exhibits character, whether it's mood or whether sometimes you can reveal pieces of a story just by talking about the landscape itself. And
Mhm.
so, if that makes sense, so what is it about the Gulf Coast that draws you to a lot of the stories that you write?
I think, I mean, when it all comes down to it, it has to do with heat and humidity and the absolutely gorgeous botanicals that grow there. From, low growing scrub palmetto to the most fragrant magnolia and gigantic magnolias, not the little tiny bay magnolias, but the big gigantic ones with the enormous leathery leaves and just gigantic trees sometimes too, very elegant. There's sort of this gentle grace about the South that I really appreciate. There's to me, not to make it a north south east west kind of thing, but I feel like in the South, something about the lines of, like, natural lines are softer. The air is heavy. So the air even it not only has a weight to it, but it's almost like you can see it, especially on a very humid day. You get off a plane coming from Columbus, Ohio, and you get off in New Orleans, and it's a wall that hits you, especially on a summer day. But even if it's December, you get out and it's very, it's funny, there was a guy I knew who was from Minnesota who went running every day on the levee that's along the Mississippi River in New Orleans. And he said, I just love it here. It's like the air. It's like holding you up. It's so thick. And he would run through that every day. But yeah, I don't know. There's just some kind of magnetic pull. There's like this intensity, especially having grown up from the age of 8 on in New Orleans, surrounded by music and amazing food and just the culture there. It's like you're walking down the street in a southern town, and well, I don't know about many places of Florida these days, but whatever. In the 1960s and 70s, and maybe even in New Orleans today, walk down the street, see somebody, they're gonna say, hi, how you doing? Because that's just the way it is. I think with the pandemic going on, even with our masks, like it's so hard to communicate when you're walking past. And so everybody's doing this because
Yeah.
you can't always see the crinkly eyes from a smile happening where there's sort of a greeting there. So, but I felt, having lived in the South and the North, in Berlin, Germany, and lots of different places, that something about the South in particular had this gentle, friendly, welcoming, I'm not going to shake your hand, I'm going to give you a hug. And so I was always drawn to go back there in my writing.
Yeah, it sounds like like it's very much a safe haven. And yeah, when you talk about the wall of, getting off the plane, you've got this wall of heat, there's that little bit of a oppressive aspect to it as well, which I can imagine rings through your story, even if you think about Vietnam in that way. In the excerpt that you just read about, how he said he was in all these places that should have been beautiful. And so it's almost the same thing, like it should have been a safe haven, but it wasn't. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, that's great to hear about those different aspects of the Gulf Coast. And growing up in the South, I can totally relate. Um, would you like to read another excerpt for us?
Sure. The another thing, because this just struck me, as far as place in terms of the novel, the the um the whole community is affected by the war, and they're all connected somehow because of being in the same community as well. And what geographically connects them is Lake Sibelia. So, and the women are, it's funny because there's a character, Lillian Walbright, the druggist's wife, who takes midnight swims. She's always swimming at night. And then there's a scene later on where Royal's wife, Minnie, Lulu's mother, she also heads off into the lake at night. She can't deal with anything. So she's going to go for a night swim. And the kids are there. They're out on the lake together on the floating dock, hanging out together. It's just a place where people gather or meet by accident, or they're on the shoreline. And the community surrounds the lake. So it's funny because I didn't even think about it when I started writing. It's one of those things that happened. And there is an actual Lake Sibelia in Florida, and it is surrounded by a Sibelia Drive. I think there's North and South Sibelia Drive or something like that.
That fits your wheel image as well,
Yeah.
too. Yeah, nice.
Funny. So the other character that I mentioned before, Helene Laurent, she was interesting to write. I think I had to sort of warm up to get into this character, and I kept avoiding her. And finally, once I did the research about the rubber plantations, I knew then sort of where to go. I can't even remember how or why or any of that. There was just something about the descriptions that I read and the photographs that I looked at. All of a sudden I could see her there. And this, of course, would be part of her memory that she's holding on to, because she can remember the past more than the present. So, but this section, she's very present. So, and it's also an introduction to Rainey, who's the other main character. And at this point, we're sort of farther into the novel, and it's December 1973. Helene's chapter is called Two Girls Laughing. And yeah, she has this moment with Rainey. So here we go. More and more, I called up memories of my mother, strolling our parterre garden in France. So exact, so different from the gardens in Vietnam. She pointed out the bright roses, the boxwood hedges, the mounds of lavender, all in need of tending and trimming, and the gardeners nodding in agreement and then whispering to each other. She'd become more demanding, more repetitive. My American doctors laughed when I told them this. They promised that it was only natural to become forgetful at 70. Not uncommon for someone your age, Mrs. Laurent. You may want to find a companion, someone to check in on you now and then. Perhaps they were right, but I wasn't fond of company and spent a lot of time inside so that no one would catch me wandering or mumbling or looking for something I hadn't even lost. And then one afternoon, Rainey stood at my back door, tall, bashful, far too quiet, like a shadow against the threshold. I had no idea she was there. I had expected to meet her eventually, but not standing on my porch, not in a way so startling. She'd cut her hand and held it out to show me. Her long fingers curled slightly around the wound. The blood came easily and pooled, her curved palm like a saucer. "What did you do?" I said. She only looked at me, her expression pale and withdrawn. "Come here," I said, and led her to the kitchen. At the white stone sink, she flinched as I held her hand under the tap, the cool water washing away the blood and revealing the depth of the cut. I pressed a tea towel against it, and there we were, face to face, never having met and now meeting. I remembered my cousin Simone in the way this girl held her head, glancing at me and then away. "I knew a girl once," I started and then stopped. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry to bother you." "You're not bothering me," I smiled. "Not at all." I didn't know where else to go. How odd, I thought. "And you live over there?" I motioned with my eyes out the window toward the clutter of dark-leaved trees, the rooftop beyond. "I've seen you and the Blackwood girl together, and I've heard you calling each other. Her name is LuLu, and yours is Rainey, yes?" I tried to understand why she had come to me, the old woman on the opposite side of the grove. She pressed her lips together. I had no idea of her pain, if she felt any. "No one was home. I thought you could help me." "That's fine," I said and tried to smile and realized I was. "You're a smart girl. You know what to do when you have to, don't you? And you even know my name." "Yes," she said. I thought she might cry. This tall child with a long curved back, long legs. Not a child at all. A girl like I'd been. Like Simone had been. "Sometimes LuLu and I look through your mail," she said, a little too sweetly. She told me they'd wished for a name as lovely and uncomplicated as mine, that they'd practiced pronouncing the syllables in the soft way they were meant to be spoken. And then she commented on the shape of my eyes, my small nose, and how my smile changed them, making them no less pretty but different. Her shyness edged forward into careful amazement, five-pointed, a stellar thing. I released her hand for a second. The cut was clean and thin and followed the lines of her palm, replicating their angles in a more dramatic way, a dividing line. Again, the blood rose inside the seam and I replaced the towel with another. Hold this tight, I told her. And when she did, I noticed the gold bracelet around her wrist, laden with little charms, flowers, stars, the smallest of shells. My kitchen wasn't bright, but this child cast something into it that reminded me of candles and the way they pushed away darkness. She reminded me too much of many things, like Simone. She stared at the towel. I wondered if she ever smiled, though I'd heard her laughing many times. She explained that a globe had fallen from the ceiling. When she bent to retrieve the biggest shard, she realized it was already done. She stood up and knew the piece was buried in her hands and frightened, quickly pulled it out. A mistake. The other pieces are still all over the floor. I listened and nodded, aware that she lived with a family that wasn't her own, that her mother, a bright silhouette, came and went. You may need stitches, I said, but that's not for me to decide. And then I thought to ask, where's your pretty mother? Away, was all she said. Her face dimmed, and I thought of other questions. How do you and LuLu get along? She responded in a vague, dreamy way, telling me that in the grove there were birds that shouldn't be there. Starlings and terns. That once LuLu, out of anger or mistrust, or perhaps just out of meanness, had thrown a collection of scallop shells, pink and orange and cream-colored, the ones Rainey's mother had brought to her long ago, into the trees, and now and then they surfaced among the tree roots. That LuLu's brother Saul had discovered a cluster of white spider lilies growing in the crook of a dead oak at the far end of the grove, where the orange trees are older and larger and where tree frogs gathered during rainstorms. That sometimes she saw me standing by the camellias, watching. So that's Helene.
Very nice. I do want to allow people to ask questions. If you have anything you'd like to ask or comment, feel free to just drop your name in the chat box. And we can certainly do that. As you were reading, I was just kind of just taking notes and thinking about, you know, the characters that you've written about and the different perspectives, and then you know, thinking about all the publications that you've gathered under your name as fiction and nonfiction, and even interviews. And I'm just wondering how all of those come together to inspire the next project. And as a follow-up, what is your next project?
Yeah, it's funny, the interviews, which are part of, it's like fiction and nonfiction combined, because I'm mostly interviewing authors, sometimes artists like dancers and people who are involved in film, things like that. But I started doing these interviews because I got stuck on the novel. And I thought, well, I'm not writing directly to the novel. I was also working on a collection of short stories while I was writing this novel, which I'm crazy. I do things like that. I do 2 different projects at a time. I read 5 different books at a time. But I realized that I really love finding out more about other artists and authors' work and what led them to their stories. And it was a way to give back to the literary community. So, and I think it's funny because out of all of those interviews that I've done, now people are giving back to me for my novel by, like you, Christy, having this conversation with me. We haven't really met before this, but there's so many people that I didn't necessarily interview them, but I knew them somehow from the literary world, whether it was grad school or a workshop or just having a conversation because I reached out because I liked somebody's book. And then it turned into sort of an online friendship kind of thing where you're emailing each other and stuff.
Mhm.
But I don't know. It's funny how in the literary world, it's it's like the rest of the world. It's so big and yet it's so small. There's so many crisscrossing moments and personalities and ideas. So, with my bigger body of work, with the, all together, what I started out with was just, flash fiction, and I've gone all the way to a novel. So it's been a pretty interesting ride. And I feel incredibly grateful to everybody that I've met. Even if I bumped heads, like somebody was really had a strong personality and thought, you're doing it all wrong. Um, and you need to go back and think about it a different way, like get rid of all these characters and write from one perspective, or whatever the suggestion might have been, um, in any vein, like whether it was a story or the novel or whatever. How much I appreciate everybody's input, and and to have a conversation
Mhm.
in in day to day, but also a conversation that is sort of intellectually and creatively inspired, is really rewarding.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
um,
So it sounds like that all that variety of writing and work that you do not only fosters your creativity, but it fosters your community, which in turn fosters your creativity. So it's
it-
really beautiful to see how all that comes together.
it's ironic too, because as writers, we're alone. There's a lot of solitude, and so, and I think, I don't know if I don't think all writers are introverts, but many of us are. And so um, that said, it doesn't matter. There's still this sort of necessity to come together as a community and share ideas and become inspired. And if you're having difficulty with something and somebody says, oh, read this story, it's going to help you, and then it's just sort of mind-boggling that that little piece of information is spot on, and it's exactly what you needed, and it heads you off into the right direction, and then maybe into a totally new direction. And you were talking
Mhm.
about what am I doing now, what am I like moving into as far as future projects. I'm doing the same thing that I did with this novel. I'm writing a novel and a collection of stories at the same
Okay.
time. And I'm sort of not in limbo at this point, but I'm doing so much, and I've done so much promotional stuff for the novel that I really haven't jumped back into this next novel. But it's a very different book. It will be a very different book. It's a quest. It's a it's a it's a road trip. It's on Highway 61, and it was I got this book by photographs by Jessica Lange, the actress, who's also a photographer, and she takes all these pictures along Highway 61. And I wrote a prompt for every, like a paragraph. I used the photographs as prompts to write at least a paragraph for every photograph. And this book is thick, so there are a lot of paragraphs. I got probably single spaced 40 plus pages. And at the end, it was exhausting because I wanted to do it quickly. I think I did it in 3 weeks. So sometimes I do 10 photographs and 10 paragraphs altogether.
Mhm.
Um, and taking those and forming them to create a novel will be very challenging, but I'm looking forward to it. And the short story collection is based on music and livelihoods of the Gulf Coast, yet again, the Gulf Coast, but specifically Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida. So these 5 Gulf states. And
Nice.
so oyster shuckers, Weeki Wachee mermaids, Mardi Gras Indians, all kinds of people.
Cool. Well, I see John has a couple of questions for you. And John, I don't know if you want to ask that directly, or would you like me to just read the question as you've written it?
Well, I'm happy to ask. Karin, I lived in, which you probably know, I lived in Fort Pierce, which is an hour north of West Palm Beach. We moved there in 1973, and so when the girls stop and are in that bus station, I thought this is Fort Pierce, but you were calling it St. Lucie, and I actually looked on the map today, and St. Lucie does exist. There are fewer than 1,000 people there. Fort Pierce never gets any love, which Fort Pierce kind of deserves not to get any love, but was that intentional?
St. Lucie was intentional in terms of LuLu. So I knew about St. Lucie from growing up in the area and from taking, well, before the big highways were in, there was just Highway 1 and Highway 1A and all that up and down the coast. But my grandmother would take different ways to go to the beach from Winter Park, Florida, where I lived, to New Smyrna. And sometimes she'd just, she'd say, oh, we're going to do this today. So we go a different way. And I believe we drove through St. Lucie. It was not a very exciting place, but it's kind of bleak. But I knew that if they were heading to West Palm Beach from the fictional town of Ana Clara, that they could possibly go through St. Lucie. And I kind of used it in terms of, it was like a literary tweak for LuLu's name.
It sounds a lot prettier than Fort Pierce too.
Yeah.
So I was also curious about Royal and his rabbits.
Okay. Did you read his chapter?
Yes. Yeah. Just why you happen to decide to have him raise rabbits.
So there's in the backstory there in a he and his squad of cat marines are in the bins. There's this whole section of hamlets called the bins, and the villagers, and this is totally fictional, I made this up, I don't know if anybody in Vietnam eats rabbits, this is just, but they had these hares that they were preparing, and it's at that point it's the late 60s, early 70s. And I can imagine that not only their rice fields have been completely decimated, but that their livestock is not either, it's either been taken by troops, and bags of rice, whatever. So there's not a lot going on. So in my backstory, I have the villagers preparing these hare to eat, and they're sharing them with the soldiers that are in the squad based in the hamlet. And they also, Anne's family has rabbits, and that's referred to in her little chapter, that her uncle and her grandfather and members of the family have rabbits. And so it's sort of, for me, it was a connection to Anne and to his time in the hamlet and how connected he became to her family and to all the villagers there, and keeping that memory alive. And with my kids growing up, we had rabbits. Not a good thing. Because who became the person in charge of the rabbits? Me. I learned a lot about rabbits. We had all the rabbits that are in Royal's hutch. We had those rabbits. Yeah, they're not, for me, I'm sure there are like people who have had great experiences with like big, beautiful, amazing rabbits in their house, but we had dwarf rabbits and they're mean. They're not nice. But Royal has this connection, and he's not going to have them inside. They're outside. And LuLu is just, she doesn't get it. She's like, what? Why in the world do you want to raise rabbits? Like, she cannot get her mind around this, but she helps him build the hutches. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know, just in the long run, like the lake, like a lot of things in literature, the rabbits became kind of a symbol. They're all of these objects, whether they're living objects or something that is either flora or fauna, or it's just a thing, like a wine bottle or a camera or a seashell or whatever. They're objects that belong to the characters. And like with Rainey and LuLu, they have this charm bracelet that was originally given to Rainey by her mother, but Rainey doesn't really want it. And she gives it to LuLu, and then that way she can hear LuLu coming. So the rabbits are like that. They're just like this, they become this identifier for Royal. And then there's I don't want to ruin it because I'm going to say a spoiler, so I'm going to stop myself. But there is a moment at the very end of the book where that little identifier comes up again. And it's very subtle, but it's there. I had an advisor tell me once, it's one of the first, actually it was the first story that I ever had published. And it's funny, they changed the title of the story. I always called it the biker and the girl. And they said, oh, that's too generic. I'm like, well, it's about a biker and a girl, but there's a crow in the story. And my advisor at that point said, okay, you got the crow, that's good. And then you have like this allusion to the crow, that's good. You need it one more time. So I don't know how many times the rabbits come up, but it's at least 3. And that little at the end, a little moment at the end. Okay.
Cool. Well, 3 is a good number.
Yeah. It's like,
it is. Go ahead.
It's like LuLu, Rainey, and Saul. A trio is always good, because then there's going to be, it's not even. It's not necessarily equilateral. It can cause problems. So.
Yeah. Well, it is just after 3. So I want to, thank everyone for being here. I wondered real quick before we go, as we near the end of the year, and I know you said you're an avid reader, what is one book that you're reading right now that you're really enjoying?
Oh, I wish I had it with me. It's in my bedroom. The End of the Point. This book was published in 2013, but I'm rereading it. It's by Elizabeth Graver. And it is a gorgeous, talk about place. It's a gorgeous tribute to this shoreline point in Massachusetts. And it's kind of a sweeping novel. It has it also has different points of view. And it goes over, starts around 1940, and it goes all the way through, I believe, 1990. So it covers a lot of territory with this one family. And it's one of these books, it's great for the winter because you can just sink into it. It's gorgeous, absolutely beautiful prose.
And it's called The End of the Point.
The End of the Point.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank everyone for being here on a Sunday afternoon. I really appreciate you, Karin, for sharing your book with us and talking a lot about the process of it and your writing. And everyone who's here in the audience, thanks for just being a part of this. This has been a really fun series for 2020. And as I said before, we're going to carry it through 2021. So stop over at hiddentimberbooks.com and you will get a chance to see who's coming up. The first one in January is the 10th of January. And that registration link will be up on the site soon. And also take another peek through the chat box and make sure you grab your link to Karin's website, or if you want to purchase a copy of her book on bookshop.org, you can. It says it's out of stock, but it should be back in stock soon, and you can always order it on back order, and it will be a nice welcoming surprise in the new year.
Thank you so much, Christy. This was great. I really appreciate your hosting, and I'm excited to see what comes next from your author series. They're always so great. And thank you everybody for being here on a Sunday afternoon. I really appreciate it. It's so great to see your faces. I love this gallery view.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great
Happy
day.
holidays.